Hi, my name is Amy. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to walk you through how I made this petticoat and what process I followed. I made this petticoat all by hand because I was using my machine to embroider the engageantes. And I have a video all about that process that I will link up above. These are the engageantes I made. While my machine was working on embroidering the engageantes, I needed a project to occupy my time and my hands. So I knew that I was going to be making this gown and petticoat, and I decided to make this by hand. And my initial intention was to just sew as much by hand as I needed to until it was time to sew on the machine. But it ended up going a little bit quicker than I expected, and I ended up finishing the whole thing by hand. So with that, let's get sewing. In order to cut the petticoat panels, I needed to take measurements over my pocket hoops and on my mannequin from the waist to the floor. And I measured the front, both sides, and the back to get the length of each measurement. Once I had the measurements, I sketched out a little pattern just so I knew how it would look when I cut each panel. In order to cut the panels, I first measured the longest side and I cut each panel to that length, which was 48 inches. And then to cut the little drop in the center front of the panel, I measured down and then used my French curve to draw the curve and then cut that line. In the 18th century, silk was only about 20 inches wide, so these petticoats would have been made out of 3 panels each for the front and the back. So once I had my panels cut, I divided them into thirds and added little false seams up the 2 sides of each panel. The front of the petticoat will have 2 ruffles and 1 snake ruffle trim. And in order to get the scalloping on the ruffles and the trim, I used spools of thread to draw the curves. And this is for the small ruffle that will go above the 2 larger ruffles. And then I used a larger embroidery thread spool to create the scallops for the large ruffles. Once all of the ruffles were marked with their edges, I used a pair of scallop-edged pinking shears to cut them out. Once I was done with the pinking shears, I used a small rolled hem on each edge of the ruffles and the trim just to prevent the edges from fraying before I attached them to the petticoat. I have a tutorial for this rolled hem, which I actually learned from Yule, Victoria, so I will link that in the card up above and also in the description down below. Once the edges of the ruffles were all hemmed, I ran a double line of gathering stitches along each of the larger 2 ruffles. These lines of gathering stitches were about 1 inch apart. The sides and back of the petticoat will be covered with the gown, so the trim doesn't have to go all the way around the petticoat. So I figured out the length of trim I wanted, and I marked that using a tape measure and electrical tape, and then I pinned my ruffles to one end of the electrical tape and pulled the gathering threads from the other end until each ruffle was the correct width. Once I had it the correct width, I tied off the gathering threads and got it ready to pin to the petticoat. I pinned it to the petticoat by finding the center front of the petticoat and the center front of the ruffle, matching those up, and then I just distributed the gathers evenly along each edge and straight across it was pinned down. I ran a single line of gathering stitches along the center of the serpentine ruffle that would go above the other two ruffles and gathered it down to be added to the front of the petticoat as well. To attach this serpentine ruffle, I followed the same process by finding the center front of the petticoat and the center of the ruffle and pinning those in place, and then I just kind of wove the ends up and down until I had a nice pattern and pinned it in place when I was happy with it. Then it was time for stitching. So much stitching. I used a longer back stitch to attach all of the ruffles to the front of the petticoat. I wasn't really careful about making sure my stitch lengths were small, as long as the thread was pulled taut and the ruffles were held securely. When attaching the larger ruffles, I realized that the gathering stitch I used was a little bit too big, and so the ruffles were a little bit odd looking. It ended up working out, but when I do this again in the future, I will make sure to use a much smaller stitch when I gather down the ruffles. Now that the front of the petticoat is all embellished and ready to go, it was time to attach the front to the back at one side seam. I did that by using a running back stitch all along the entire seam, except for the top 12 inches that I left open to make into the pocket slit. The petticoat panels are only attached on one side for now. Since the two panels were sewn together on the selvage edge, I really didn't need to finish this seam allowance, but I wanted to do it as authentically as possible. So I went ahead and felled each side individually, and that also ended up finishing the pocket openings for me as well. I'm not sure what happened to the footage of me pleating the entire petticoat, but this is all I have. As you can see, I started out with a box pleat in the front and then knife pleats towards the back on each side. And then the back of the petticoat is just the opposite, with an inverted box pleat in the center and knife pleats toward the back along each side. Then I sewed up the final side seam using the same method I used on the first. I used a running back stitch to make the seam, and then I felled down each side of the seam individually, which also finished the pocket opening. And here is where I realized I did actually use my machine on this petticoat in one spot, and that was to baste down the pleats along the top of the front and the back. To attach the waist ties, I found the center of the tie and matched it to the center of the right side of the petticoat piece I was working on, and then I pinned it securely along the side to each pocket slit. This process was repeated for the front of the petticoat. The bottom edge of the twill tape was secured to the petticoat using a very tiny slip stitch all along the bottom edge. After the twill tape was secured, I folded it to the inside of the petticoat and used a small slip stitch to attach the loose edge to the petticoat so that the entire twill tape was secure. The petticoat was hemmed using a 1-inch double folded hem and then a cross stitch to secure it in place. And here you can see the hem is complete. This is the inside. And on the outside you can barely see tiny little spots where the stitches are. I hope this video was enjoyable, and if you are getting ready to make your own 18th century petticoat, maybe it was a little bit helpful. I will put all of the resources that I refer to or used in the description down below. And the next project, or next piece of this project that I'm working on is the gown. It is a plaid sack back, so look for that video in the future. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you would like to see more from me, please subscribe. And if you hit the little bell, YouTube will let you know every time I upload. Thanks for watching.